Rome, the year 1480. In a cold stone room within the Palazzo Sforza, a baby girl was born into shadow and ambition. No prayers were spoken, only the strained breaths of a midwife and the silent gaze of her father, a cardinal of the church, but never a father in any earthly sense. Lucrezia. Her name was not meant for love. It was a mark, a tool, a reminder that from her first breath, she belonged to a dynasty where mercy had no home. The Borgia family was no sacred lineage. Rodrigo Borgia, her father, was a cunning Spaniard, a priest who lived like a king. He drank, played music, seduced trust, and whispered schemes in the dark. Among the many women in his chambers was Vanozza de Catania, Lucrezia's mother, once cherished, later discarded like a candle burned too low. Lucrezia grew up in a house thick with perfume and rot. There were long halls painted with gold, but beneath the gilded layers were secrets, blood, and names erased in silence. She was taught to read scripture, to speak Latin, to dance in orange groves, and to remain silent when men entered the room. Even as a child, Lucrezia was beautiful, not with innocence, but with something unsettling, as if heaven had gifted her a curse disguised as grace. Her hair was the color of honey, her eyes as pale as winter lakes, and her lips always closed as though they knew too much. Rodrigo never looked at her like a daughter. He saw a treasure, a pawn, a golden piece on a chessboard of power. When she was just 11, he arranged her engagement to a Spanish nobleman she had never met. Then he broke it off when the alliance lost its value. 3 times Lucrezia was offered, withdrawn, and offered again, like a toy passed between kings. No one asked what she wanted. No one imagined she might refuse. And then, in 1492, everything changed. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. Rome trembled. A pope with 4 bastard children, a man accused of murder, bribery, lust, and corruption. But the Vatican did not need saints. It needed men who could buy them. Lucrezia was 12 when she entered the Vatican, not as a sinner, but as the Holy Father's daughter. They called her the Princess of Sin, but she was still a child. Each night she lay in cold silence, listening to the wind howling through ancient stone windows. She whispered prayers, not knowing if anyone was still listening. In her earliest dreams, there were no thrones, no knives, only the faded face of her mother and a locked door that never opened. But Rome does not let anyone dream for long. The wedding was beautiful. White lilies draped the marble altar. Nobles lined the pews, whispering behind their jeweled fans. And Lucrezia, she stood still, her hands trembling beneath silk gloves, her eyes cast downward, trained like a falcon taught never to fly. She was 13. Her husband, Giovanni Sforza, was 26. Lord of Pesaro, soldier by blood, puppet by marriage. To Rome, it was a political triumph. To Lucrezia, it was a ceremony of silence. They said she smiled that day, but it was not joy. She smiled like the moon reflects sunlight, not by choice, but by design. In the weeks that followed, whispers began to grow louder in the Vatican corridors. They said Giovanni was weak, unfit, too independent for a Borgia bride. Rodrigo, now Pope, wanted a husband he could control. Cesare, Lucrezia's brother, sharp as a blade, colder than a tomb, shared that wish. The Sforza match had served its purpose. Now it had to be broken. And so began the rumors that Giovanni was impotent, that he could not fulfill his duty as a man, that Lucrezia, still a child, was untouched, pure, and waiting. Rome fed on scandal like wolves to blood. Humiliated and cornered, Giovanni fled. He accused the Pope of trying to poison him. He claimed that Lucrezia was not a virgin, that she had slept with her own brother, Cesare, that the child she carried was not her husband's, but her father's. That word again, incest. It spread like fire across Europe. Princes, popes, peasants, they all wanted to believe it, and yet no one knew the truth, because the truth lay quiet inside Lucrezia's silence. She said nothing, not when the church annulled her marriage on the grounds of non-consummation, not when Giovanni begged her to speak, to protect his name, not when strangers stared at her belly, counting months, counting sins. She entered a convent for a time, for reflection, they said, but she did not pray. She stared through the iron bars of her window, listening to the nuns chant about heaven, while her own soul wandered through a darker place, between shame, power, and something else she couldn't name, something sharp, something waking. In March of 1498, a small boy was born. No name was given. Later, the Vatican claimed he was Cesare's illegitimate child. Then Rodrigo said he was the father. No mother was ever listed. Lucrezia never spoke of him again. When she returned to court, she was quieter than before. But her smile, still sweet, still soft, was now unreadable. She had learned something in the silence, that survival was not about truth. It was about obedience, and waiting for the moment when obedience becomes power. By the time Lucrezia Borgia was 17, she no longer waited to be saved. She had seen too much, felt too little, and learned that love, if it existed at all, was a kind of performance, staged for men who believed in their own power. Her second marriage was not of her choosing either. Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, young, handsome, with sun-warmed skin and a kind voice. He was no threat to Rome, just another alliance, another peace. But Alfonso, unlike the others, loved her. And for a moment, brief and dangerous, Lucrezia loved him too. They whispered to each other in the dark, spoke of Naples and freedom, and dreams that dared to exist outside Vatican walls. He made her laugh, and perhaps that was his mistake, for Rome does not forgive softness. Cesare had grown hungry, no longer satisfied to be the Pope's son. He wanted to be a prince, a general, a storm. He renounced his cardinal robes and took up a sword, and Naples, Alfonso's homeland, stood in the way. One night, Alfonso was attacked, strangled on the palace steps. He survived the first attempt. Lucrezia tended to him herself, hands shaking as she pressed cloth to his wounds. She begged her father, her brother, the priests in their silks, "Spare him." For once, her voice rose above a whisper. But mercy is not a language the Borgias speak. A few days later, a man entered Alfonso's sick room. He wrapped a cloth around the young duke's throat and squeezed until no more breath came. Lucrezia was not there, but when she arrived, she did not scream. She sat beside the bed, took her husband's hand in hers, and wept so quietly it sounded like prayer. After that, she changed. They married her again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to Ferrara, a proud, cold court that saw her as a Borgia stain. But Lucrezia had learned how to wear her sorrow like a veil. She spoke gently, moved carefully, played the role of duchess with aching perfection. And then she ruled, not with armies, not with threats, but with silence, letters, small alliances, and eyes that never blinked. She founded a court of artists and poets, built hospitals, wrote state documents in her own hand. She wore black when she pleased, refused when she chose, and when her father died, and when Cesare was captured and stripped of power. Lucrezia remained. While the men fell, she endured. But endurance came at a cost. She buried her children, she buried her name. And in the end, even her body gave way. At 39, after a final failed childbirth, Lucrezia slipped away, quietly, the way she had lived. The world remembered her as poison, a seductress, a sinner. But in truth, she was a girl born without choices, who became a woman who shaped kingdoms from silence. Not the velvet-cloaked monster of myth, but the velvet knife hidden in plain sight.